make a start, yeah. Okay, we've called this session Data for International Social Science Research, what we have and what we need. I want to say a few words before I hand over to the speakers for this session. A few words about the background and the history as to why this session exists within the programme of the forum. This goes back a few years to a decision made by the National Science Foundation, the USA, and the Economic and Social Research Council of the UK to see what these two agencies could do to try to promote international collaboration in the social sciences. And after receiving a report which was commissioned from the Social Science Research Council of New York, the two agencies held a series of meetings with many other agencies, funding agencies from around the world engaged in those meetings. And various decisions were made, one of which was to promote better use of data for international research in the social sciences. Now, what do we mean by international research? Many people think immediately of comparative research. Well, that's a part of it. But the way we've interpreted international research is that there are now so many problems which do not have national boundaries. We've seen, obviously, over the last year or so, the interconnectedness of our global economies and the implications when things start going wrong and the repercussions that this has around the world and the speed with which that happens. We're already aware of pandemic flu, the implications now in terms of the extent to which global travel certainly promotes the spread of viruses much more quickly than before. We've heard this morning, and we're well aware obviously of climate change. We're aware also of the implications of major movements of the population, migration, etc. All of these problems transcend national boundaries and require us as social science researchers to examine more closely the causes and consequences of these processes. It requires interdisciplinary working, a point that's been made many times before, but it requires us to add a social science dimension to problems which have often fallen into the domains of other scientific disciplines. The view was taken that we need to examine much more closely and prioritise the way in which resources are directed towards the development of resources for research in this area. That requires lots of things. It requires us to get together with international agencies to identify needs particularly, and to look at the resources and to prioritise those needs in terms of how we move forward. Who should do what? How should it be funded? What is it we're trying to do? In this process, we call it Plans to Develop an International Data Forum. You'll probably hear a little bit more about this as the presentations proceed. We've been seeking to look very closely at what actually happens now. So that's the first part of these presentations, is what is it we have and what do we need? One of our presentations, the one from Kevin Schurer, takes this title, the title of the session, as the title of the topic, the presentation that Kevin will make. But this is a very eclectic mix of presentations that you'll see this afternoon. What we've tried to do in putting this short programme together is to bring together developments from the northern hemisphere and from the southern hemisphere, from Brazil and South Africa in the southern hemisphere, and from the USA and a more kind of European perspective from Kevin Schurer in the northern hemisphere. We want you to absorb this information, to look at these developments, to criticise, to comment, and to help us to explore where and how we need to develop our resources for international research. This is a very open agenda, and it's one, I think, which will benefit enormously from further discussion, particularly with the science communities concerned. So I'm going to turn over now, having made that little statement about this is the reasons underlying this session, turn over first of all to Julia Lane, whose topic is very interesting indeed. It's all about developing research knowledge in an area where data is notoriously hard and difficult to find. And looking forward very much to Julia's presentation on this. My little crib notes: Julia is the Programme Director of the Science and Innovation Policy Programme at the National Science Foundation. Her previous jobs included Senior Vice President and Director, Economics Department at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, Director of the Employment Dynamics Program at the Urban Institute and Senior Research Fellow at the US Census Bureau, and Assistant, Associate and Full Professor at American University. Julia, it's a great privilege to have you here. Thank you very much.
Delighted to be here. So do I just click on this, or is that? So I'd like to talk a little bit about the data needs for the science of science policy. And let me just walk you through what this is. Oh, what? Okay. So this is a major challenge, is trying to understand the changes in economic activity that have occurred globally. 300 years ago, the way in which value was added was through making and selling food. And so we collected data on food production, and we understood the way in which value was created from land. And then the Industrial Revolution came along, and all of a sudden value was increasingly created by producing goods from manufacturing. And, you know, if you think about the convulsion that happened in economic thought and social thought, people were trying to understand how could value be added from creating goods, right? And Karl Marx, for example, thought that value could be added by the labor theory of value, that it was the amount of labor input. And eventually what happened was people realized that you could describe what was going on with the production function, and you needed to collect data on output and capital, labor, energy, materials. You had a Clem model, and those were the kinds of data and the conceptual framework within which we operated. Now we're in a situation where the value that is added in terms of economic activity and social activity is through ideas. And so the process of innovation seems to be what generates high-quality jobs and competitive firms and so on. But we really don't have a data infrastructure that can guide our policy and our investments that are set up to spur innovation. And of course, science is one part of that. So what happens is we can actually measure R&D. So what you see countries doing in terms of trying to spur innovation is they set R&D targets. So Finland, for example, has set a target of 4%. The United States has set a target of GDP of 3%. And other countries appear to think that, if we only invest enough in R&D, then somehow we'll get scientific changes and we'll get innovation as a result of that. And what I'm going to argue is that having only data on one area, that is R&D, is a real problem, because that's what's being used to guide science and innovation policy. And it's quite likely that those kinds of decisions are misguided. In fact, if you think about what the process is of innovation, it's a complex interrelationship of human beings and social organizations. So simple investments in R&D are unlikely to be the right approach. Okay, and we can see that, for example, in different countries. So, for example, the United States certainly invested in R&D, and that stimulated economic growth. The 3/4 of productivity growth has been linked to R&D investments, but that's certainly not been the case in Sweden. Sweden's invested very heavily, and there hasn't been a commensurate growth in the economy, nor has it happened in Japan. And huge investments in R&D didn't get them out of problems in the 1990s. And so basically, the idea that we currently have, which is you have your standard production function, and if you just invest more in the inputs, that more output will come out. is actually no longer the case. You've got a much more complex infrastructure, and this is just one of the many pictures that you sometimes see to try and describe the innovation ecosystem. It's highly nonlinear. It's not like you put in R&D at one end and out pop something at the other end. You need to understand organizational structures, you need to understand incentives, you need to understand the political infrastructure, and there are many measures that are much more important, for example, the interaction between human beings. And what that then means is economics, I'm an economist, but economics is no longer the queen, right? You need to have information from a vast array of social sciences, and you need to describe that process before you start to collect data on it. And of course, even once you're starting to think about what those processes look like, you can immediately see what the empirical challenges are. So for example, we're used to thinking about individuals as being a unit of analysis or firms. Sometimes it might be more complex and we struggle with defining a family. But here you've got an even more complex infrastructure. If you think of the basic unit of the initial part of the discovery process as being, is it an individual? Is it a team? Is it a production team or a product team? Is it a firm? Is it the organization? Is it the social infrastructure within which it occurs? There's a lot of discussion about different social environments, for example, cultural differences across countries. How do you collect data on counterfactuals? How do you describe the global nature of the scientific enterprise? We're no longer, because of the mobility of ideas, right? Land you can't move from one country to another. Physical manufacturing, you could move a little bit more, but with ideas, you have a free flow of ideas, and you have a global enterprise of scientists and engineers. And you need to collect data for a very long time sometimes in order to see how investments in science or investments in research have an impact. So you need to start collecting now to start to describe processes that might not bear fruit for 20 or 30 years in the future. There are a bunch of, another set of challenges are analytical. You've got disciplinary differences. So investments in agriculture and in biology or chemistry or physics, they're very different in the structure of the science and in the way in which ideas are communicated. Okay? So, and what you're dealing with increasingly, because you're dealing with human interactions, the idea generating process, much more than the physical production of goods or physical production of food, the idea producing process is typically the interaction of human beings, not just in the aha moment of discovery, but in the adoption and transmission of ideas. So that means that you then have to deal with heterogeneous data, and typically from many different sources, because people communicate through emails or through blogs or through a particular project space and through publications and citations and in a virtual organization space, for example, in YouTube, scientists are now communicating in that way, or in Second Life and so on. So capturing the data is no longer going and getting survey information, because that's slow and you're very often describing something that is not amenable to nice little boxes. It may not even be administrative data. It may be what scientists now, social scientists, are doing to capture data on human beings. You use sensors or RFIDs to get a sense of who do you physically communicate with, or scrape emails, or videotape human interactions and describe how those are going on. So how do you turn those heterogeneous pieces of information into something that is both analytical, that is other people can look at so that the analysis is replicable, and it can be generalized. So this is you can see where there are huge empirical challenges associated with this very important data collection activities. And then there's very pragmatic issues. If you think about science investments, they're typically made by large funding agencies, large federal or public funding agencies, or by organizations. And typically, if you take a look at the way in which science foundations in particular collect data, the entire operation is set up to manage proposals and to manage awards. So you have a science data infrastructure that's targeted towards proposal administration, not management information. So you've got massive amounts of different pieces of data, but it's not longitudinally linked, it's not trackable. There's no coupling of science investments with scientific and economic outcomes. So let me give you an example. So if I make an award to Peter Elias, right? Unlikely, but... So how do I track his output? Well, there's no standard tracking mechanism because he can get awards from different enterprises let me make a US specific case, but it's true in many other areas. And the only way I can track his output is by looking at citations, scraping the citations off the web, for example. And we're lucky because I'm sure there's not too many Peter Eliases, so it's not too hard to track him. But with the globalization of science, there are a lot of Kims and Parks and Lees and Takayamas and Jones and Smiths, and it's almost there's no way of identifying who those individuals are over time once the award's been made. In other words, there's no unique identifier whereby we can track those science investments. Okay? So that's a major challenge in its own right, and increasingly a challenge with our ability to track publications. So there are other challenges as well. One is that typically what you're really trying to do when you're worrying about a science of science policy is you're trying to provide relatively timely information about what impacts are to policymakers, and those data obviously don't exist. A more important area, I think, is also how do you use the data that you collect in order to inform the key constituents. Now, what I mean by that is the people who are receiving information about science is not just the scientific community, but it's policymakers, it's the media, it's businesses, it's the broader public who you want to engage in science policy. So how do you convey useful information to those broader groups? Now, what scientists have traditionally done is they've done tables or graphs, or we have something at the NSF, and I think other science agencies have, which is kind of highlights, and they tell little anecdotes and stories and so on. But it turns out there's a very rich and growing scientific community that is thinking about how to take data and convey it in a visually appealing way. So there's this whole area of visual analytics in particular, which says, there are ways of conveying how science is evolving and changing that go beyond tables and that go beyond graphs that we're used to doing. And at the same time, what one might want to think about is not just engaging the public, but also how do you engage the scientific community to provide information about their activities. So what do we currently do? We currently ask researchers to submit annual reports, and that goes as long as the grant goes. But what we're really interested in doing is what's the long-term impact of the science investment. So asking them to submit annual reports, which I hate to tell you this, but a lot of times just end up in a dust-filled folder somewhere, electronic folder, but don't get used they don't get used in a scientific way. How do you get the scientific community to provide you that information in a dynamic and ongoing way? Well, it turns out there's a whole literature in this area too, which you can see with the development of collaborative tagging and the Web 2.0. So if you could figure out incentives, aka some notoriety is not the right word, but some fame associated with what you're producing rather than it disappearing into an annual report, then the scientific community might be willing to provide data on a flow basis. So that's a scientific challenge in its own right. And let me give you an illustration of this visualization stuff. So this is taken from, this is called Mapping the Evolution of Co-Authorship Networks. And this gives you a sense of, you see one person who writes something and then you see someone else who cites it, and then you can see how these little groups develop and grow. And everyone looks at those, and everyone likes the visualization stuff. But this, to me, is emblematic of the pragmatic challenges that I described to you in the preceding slides. So there are a couple of sets of challenges. First of all, there's no access to these data. These are very black boxy data. Secondly, it's not clear exactly what these are telling me. I don't know what the size of the dots mean. I don't know what the distance means. I don't know if, as those dots change, whether there's any statistical difference. So, as human beings, people process red and yellow and blue differently. So how are you guys processing whatever that information is? Is it the same as the underlying true representation? And then the last point goes back to the point I made earlier, which is because I don't have any data that can couple science investments with science outcomes, I don't have any idea. I've got some person in the middle who's a big red blob, McKinley, let's say, or Schneiderman. So Schneiderman's starting something out. I have no way of saying what those initial investments were, by which agencies, how much, who was involved. And while I'm looking here at citations, so I don't have any idea of the input. While I'm looking here at the citations, I can see how the citations have gone, but I don't have any way of tracking that through to any eventual set of outcomes. Okay? So the policy levers that are associated with this picture are also relatively unclear. So since I started in on this science of science and innovation policy, this has concerned me a great deal because it's very difficult to do policy in the absence of a sound empirical foundation. So a possible crisis-inducing event is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, but you have similar acts in other countries. This is what's known as the stimulus package. And so the stimulus package, there was a lot of investment in science, just as there has been in other countries. And as you are well aware, those countries in a few years are going to want to know what's been the value added from my investment. And we're not going to be able to answer that question unless we build the data infrastructure to answer it now. And in addition, not only are we interested in being able to answer to policymakers, but here we have a golden opportunity of a natural experiment in which, in principle, we should be able to collect the data ourselves and start answering some very, very interesting social science questions. I know I'm going to run out of time, so, well, I'm not going to go through this because I think I'm out of time. 2 minutes, okay. So what I think would be the ideal approach would be to start to build a science of science policy data infrastructure that creates a backbone that's based out of administrative records. In other words, try to get science agencies to do the minimum amount that's necessary to take their existing data infrastructures and just streamline them so you can move out of the program administration and into management information system. That is a tweak that, with the action-inducing event of the ARRA, should be able to do in principle. The same thing with the academic institutions. What we should be able to do is, rather as we currently have only information on the principal investigator and the co-principal investigator, capture information on all the individuals who are supported by those grants. Because those individuals, the science agencies will argue they're as important as the actual research that's being done, but we have no idea who they are, other than that the odd anecdote occurs, like one of the guys who was supported by an NSF fellowship went off to start Google, right? But it's all anecdotal in nature. So set up an infrastructure where we can capture who is supported by the science funding as well, match those to other administrative records, and then once you've got that infrastructure, set up a broader capacity for the scientists to keep adding information about what they've done and make that transparent. Now, I don't know if I can I do a hyperlink here? Oh, okay. So think about how to build up a Web 2.0 application on that backbone. And you could think about many ways of doing that, where scientists can, where the academic institution, instead of putting up just awards on their website, permit scientists to add information on a flow basis. And if you've ever gone onto the Zappos site, like the online store, go onto that, and what you can see is a map of the US. It's an online store. Anytime anyone buys something, up pops a picture of what they bought and where it came from with the metadata associated with it. So you could imagine, anytime I get a publication, I'd upload it to the site, because then you get the immediate gratification of seeing on NSF or on my university, there's the award and the information about it, or a publication, or a patent, or a firm startup, or consulting, or my graduate student got a job, anything to generate information popping up on the site. Those data could get collected and be built into that broader infrastructure. And you could use that to, going back to the data dissemination issue that I think is as important as the data collection and data analysis, set up RSS feeds so that businesses and policymakers can see, in my constituency or in my discipline, something has happened as a result of that science award. So the next steps in terms of the interest, for example, of this group, would be, it would be really nice to develop a pilot on setting up the administrative data infrastructure simply to get the unique PI IDs or unique individual IDs, and set that up so that there can be cooperation across countries, since you've got a global science and engineering enterprise, and build onto that frame all these different ways of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating data. So that was probably a lot of information to throw at you all at once, but that's kind of the challenge, if you like, to social scientists in studying science policy.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you very much, Julia.
Who's next?
Intriguing and interesting challenge indeed. We're going to take, it's time for 2 or 3 questions before we move on to the next session, so just stay where you are if you've got any.
I do what I'm told.
I'm assuming that the conference organisers will put these presentations on the conference website after the event. Is there any information on that?
Sounds like.
So because there are some interesting slides that you flicked over very quickly that I would like to look at. I'm sure others would as well. So let's assume that will happen.
Well, it was fear of the chair.
Well, just a quick comment to say the your vision in terms of reporting and following outcomes, impact, and so on is totally consistent with what we're attempting to do in Canada. And we have some interesting strategies linked to what you say, and my sense at least is internationally, this is a top of the list kind of priority that we should be able to share strategies and best practices and so on and move this dossier very, very quickly. And I love the way you presented that, and we're totally behind you.
Fantastic. I'd like you to be next to me, not behind me, though. Or even leading the charge.
Well, I mean,
yeah, no, it sounds like, yeah.
Some aspects of it that were, particularly your idea of the researcher going in and forever, ever, amen. You know, those final reports that we all used to do and so on, we're burying all that and
yeah.
we're engaging a dynamic system that's a lifelong sort of approach to it. So it's very much what you have in mind.
If I could get, because we're kind of trying to get a pilot project started in the United States, so if we could piggyback off what you've done and collaborate, that would be fantastic.
Sure. I'm just curious, you refer frequently to citations and publications as the kind of standard output that we still, it's really still the industry standard of the way we measure our output as scientists. I'm biomedical, so it's even more the case, I think, in biomedical sciences. But I just wonder, is there any move to try, you've described other things here that could be counted as science reduction, but is there any consensus on a sort of ranking order of what those things might be? I mean, one of the things we're talking about is raw data sets, for example.
Oh, yeah.
As something that has its own form of citation index and is also taken into account in awards and etc. Is there any consensus growing around what those things would be?
Well, we're even looking at things like click streams. And so I'm funding, there we go, here's Zappos. But no, people are sleeping right there. You go. Someone's bought something there, right? And you can someone else has bought something. That's what they bought, and you can click on that and get the metadata. Oh, someone bought. So you can imagine. You can imagine how that might be exciting. So yeah, citations, I think, I'm very worried about the focus on citations because it's, the coverage is different, the way in which it works is different. Sometimes there's 5 or 6 years before a citation comes out. That varies by discipline.
Very often you cite people because they're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very high citation.
Well, yeah, that was always the joke. Well, I better not say it because this is being taped, otherwise I'll tell you afterwards. So about a certain very famous economist whose CV was twice as long as it should be because the paper and then the retraction. So the clickstream data, so you can see what you're really interested in doing is how are ideas transmitted and adopted. And so what I'm collaborating pretty heavily with the visual analytics people. And the reason that I'm doing that is they've already invested huge amounts in describing how ideas are created and transmitted and adopted, collecting data from very heterogeneous sources in the terrorist community, right? So they've had buckets and buckets of money from the Department of Homeland Security. But the whole process by which ideas come up and are transmitted is exactly the same way, and they're communicating via email and telephone and project sites, believe it or not. But there's massive amounts of heterogeneous data. So we're collaborating with those guys to try and see if there's something better, or not better than, but that can be used as well as the citations approach. And remember, that's only an intermediate output. What you're really interested in is in the science.
Well, and in the policies that change on the basis of that. So can you look at it from the other angle and start with research among policymakers to say, what made you change your mind? What science did you look at? What did you?
That's right. Yeah.
Are we doing that?
Yeah, I'm doing that. I'm funding someone who's doing some research in that area right now, actually interviewing policymakers and saying, what evidence do you need? What and how should it be presented? Although quite often they're not going to know, right? But that's another story.
Well, we must move on, and we're running out of time for our later speakers. So thank you very much, Julia. That was a fascinating presentation, and I'm sure many people will be contacting you later to pick up on some of this. Now I won't say change tack. We certainly move from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, and I'm asking Daisy Selemasala to present on the title of her talk is Towards the Establishment of the World Data Centre in Africa, Biodiversity and Human Health. Is South Africa ready for the challenge? Daisy is the Executive Director, Knowledge Management and Evaluation Directorate in the National Research Foundation in South Africa. I should add that I first met Daisy probably about 3 years ago now, when she was then promoting the African digital curation initiative, and I was very impressed with her dynamism and her enthusiasm for the subject. I'm sure that you'll get a flavour of that with her presentation. So Daisy, over to you.
Okay, I want to open this now. I don't understand.
Oh.
Okay.
Which one was it?
Okay.
This one here? Okay, let's go there. And now we go down
Where's
here.
the F5 now?
There you go.
Okay.
And just use these arrow keys.
Okay, I'm an information specialist by profession. I'm a librarian, what you call, but I'm not a StoneAge.com librarian. That's why we're information specialists. And we're much more towards the information age and especially data management. So what I'm going to share with you today is sort of a case study of what we do as a nation in South Africa regarding data management, and it ties in with what Julia was talking about. But for us, it's much more on the practical side. If you think that you are going to hear theory from me, I'm not a theoretical person. I'm much more of a practical person in nature. So I'm going to give you a brief overview about all the activities relating to data activities in South Africa and what we do, because it's easier when you collaborate if you have to do data sharing and data stewardship. I'll give you, like I said, background on national initiatives, what we are doing. Look at the Network of Data Information Curation Center. I think you are aware that librarians tend to talk a lot about acronyms, DDC and so forth. So if you hear me say Netic, remember that I'm talking about the Network of Data Information Curation Center. The Ministry of Science and Technology conducted an exploratory study in 2007. I'm going to tell you more about that and what came out of that study, the policy changes that emanated from that, and also a policy workshop that was also established by the Ministry of Science and Technology, looking at data access as a nation and also what the OECD guidelines are saying to us regarding data, and also look at the first African digital curation workshop or conference that we hosted last year in the country to see and hear the feel about what people think and scientists think about data access and data curation in totality, and also look at the ICSU, International Council for Scientific Union, issues regarding world data centers and why we got to host the first world data center in Africa focusing on human health and biodiversity. Okay, the first one is on the network, Netic, which was established in 2006, October. Netic comprises of a few science councils. I'll come to that one. And the Ministry of Science and Technology, the study that they commissioned was also in August 2007. After that, immediately we had a workshop in September 2007 to look at the issues coming out of the exploratory study and also discuss what needs to happen with the scientists and the decision makers. And also following after that, then we had our conferences. I'm disorientated here. Okay. So who's Netic? The network. Who comprises Netic? We have the National Research Foundation, which is my funding agency, but our mandate is quite broader than that. We don't just give grants like Julia said. We give grants, we offer monitoring and evaluation services, and also knowledge management for the country. And we have the Human Sciences Research Council as part of the team, the Council for Scientific Industrial Research, the CSIR of South Africa, Academy of Sciences of South Africa is also part of the Netic stakeholder group, and also our Minister of Science and Technology, they are also part of the group, and one university that represents other universities. Because we are based in Pretoria, the University of Pretoria is quite central to our activities. What's the idea behind Netic? What we want to do was to provide an enabling environment. Other than that, to provide thought leadership regarding data management, also build capacity amongst our scientists and researchers and knowledge workers, and also have a good user community around that. And what's our objective, like I said again, it's to actually look at a common place or a repository or a clearinghouse regarding data activities in the country. And also to ensure that we have a low-cost infrastructure setup that we can also use as a nation and probably expand it later. And also look at the issues of having a centers of excellence regarding data management, whether we can have use postdoc students to come and assist us in the project or not. And also ensure that we have accessible practices and standards that we can all use, because, you know, as domains or fields differ, people tend to use their own standards and decide, this is what I want to do. As a scientist, within my field, this is what I'll do. One day when I kick the bucket, what do I do? 10 things to do before I die. Then I say, I want my data sets to be inherited by this institution, and we have to go and drag everything that's there. And it's no longer useful, and so forth. And also ensure that we have a distributed network with what we want to achieve with this curation center. And the issue was that when we were talking about this in 2006, we're not sure how we're going to unfold the process, whether it's going to be a virtual system or, you know, 4 walls around the system. But things are moving forward. So the Ministry of Science and Technology, based on that, decided to hold a workshop after the exploratory study they conducted in 2007 August to say, the study indicated that people really feel, as South African as decision makers really feel there is a need to look into the issue of access as a country and how do you actually make that data available and why do we need to deposit data. A desktop research was done also, and everything augments what was discussed with the face-to-face introductions and discussions, and also with the desktop studies. And the outcome was that there is significant data curation activity taking place in the country, and most of them are domain-driven. For example, with spatially related data, people are actually doing a lot of activities, but we tend to hoard or say it's mine and I don't want to share. That was what was happening currently in the country. And the findings of the study was that there's an issue regarding ownership. Scientists felt that who's going to own data issues? Preservation, curation issues came into place. Funding. The funders like the National Research Foundation, what's our role regarding public access and public funded research? Also systems and technologies, which ones are we going to use if we use interoperable systems? What's our dimension regarding that? And the issue of IKS. As Africa and as South Africa, we can't talk about systems without talking about indigenous knowledge systems. And I think most third world countries will also talk about that. What happens if I share with you what's tacit and explicit knowledge? What's in it for me? And these are the issues that are also of continuous issues in the country also. And out of the study that was done by the ministry, these are a few issues that came out from the study, that there needs to be merits regarding research data sharing. We need to expand on what's currently happening with data sharing and what people are actually doing, and also to ensure that there's we minimize duplication regarding data activities, and also ensure that there's quality regarding content format and skills availability, that the people are trained to ensure that whatever we do, data collection and data management activities and up to stewardship, we all have equitable and standardized approaches to that. And also the issue of IP, it's a big issue that if I share, what's going to happen? Will I be cited and so forth? So those are part of the issues. And again, the issue of IKS and trust. If you go to the San community, like now we know that the Houdia, what happened to the Houdia in the Cape and where's that IKS residing now? So those were the issues that came up. And the possible solutions out of this that are summarized what people thought, or researchers thought, that there must be a combination of I give you the carrot and what you give me if we want to share data. And then still South Africa, it's still an evolving democracy that scientists normally, when they publish their research, they get funding for that. If you have an article published in a peer-reviewed journal, you get funding from Department of Education. And that's how we're trying to promote data sharing and so forth. A policy workshop on data and access followed also in September regarding these issues. And here we're mainly looking at the OECD guidelines. South Africa has an observer status within the OECD communities. So we're looking at what do the OECD guidelines say to us as a nation, especially regarding public funded research. And out of this, we identified obstacles and how we can improve data access and so forth as a nation. And the findings also corroborate what the Minister of Science and Technology exploratory study did. And out of that, we decided to have the first African Digital Curation Conference last year in February month to talk now to the general public, the students we funded a number of postgrad students. We funded researchers from all over the country and decision makers to come and talk about the issues regarding data access and data management. And there was a need identified to say, yes, we know so-and-so is doing this and that, but as postgrad students and so forth, I don't know much more about the importance of data and why do I have to give you my data sets and so forth, especially primary data. What do we do with that? We have a system in the country, Nexus, which is hosted by my directorate. Nexus is a system or a database where you look at what projects are being done in the country. If you do your master's or doctoral studies, you have to go there first and check what's being done. But we don't have data sets there. And that's the issue now that the National Research Foundation is looking at. What can we do to ensure that people actually submit as part of the funding mechanism? We want you to say, where are you going to deposit the data? But we only have the South African Data Archive, and we need a much more better platform, and that's what I'm getting at now. Out of all that, we were looking at other initiatives. I serve on CoData, the Committee on Data and Technology in Paris. I'm the task group leader for data sources for sustainable development in Southern Africa. And I was tasked into looking at a database of data producers in Africa. And whilst we're looking at that, together with our South African Data Archive, we wanted to submit a proposal to ICSU, International Council for Scientific Unions, to say, we understand that you fund issues regarding data activities and so forth, and we want to have much more an advanced platform on how we can actually have proper interoperable systems for data access and data management. We submitted our proposal to ICSU through the World Data Center panel. It was accepted last year, June, and out of that, we have been having discussions regarding how we're going to move ahead with having to host the first World Data Center on biodiversity and human health in Africa. But we start with the elephant that we know, Southern Africa, first before we can move up into Africa. And the idea for the ICSU panel on World Data Center is to look at building capacity and developing expertise in less economically developed countries, expand scientific disciplines within the World Data Centers, which are much more relevant to ICSU programs like we had this morning at the plenary when Roberta and the climate change discussions took place. It's part of the Millennium Development Goals that ICSU looks into also. And also looking at the broadening the geographic distribution of data management, we talk about the North and South divide, and this is what the World Data Center looks at because we don't have a World Data Center in Africa. So the NRF was given this mandate to say, you champion the process, and the grant that we got was only 30,000 euros, which is nothing to run a project like this. And we are using our current platform, SADA, South African Data Archive, SCION, which is our South African Environment Observation Network, which is hosted by the National Research Foundation, and also the prototype database for CoData to brainstorm the process. Now, what's World Data Centers? That's what you want to know. They were created 50 years ago after the International Geophysical Year to manage geophysical and solar data on a global scale. The other issues for the World Data Centers is to offer guidance regarding what needs to happen based on the Millennium Development Goals, especially in Africa. And ICSU and the World Data Centers are mainly supported by nations all over the world. It's a worldwide national thing with all the federations that belong to that. And the main idea also is to archive and disseminate data and information. That's why we have this interest in forming this global initiative, and in fact that we don't just want to focus on the social sciences, but also ensure that we form part of the natural sciences. There were trends that led us to say we want Netic to work, but we didn't know how Netic, the network of data and information curation, was going to unfold or work or operate. And we felt that the World Data Center is a better platform for us to ensure that we have an interoperable system. So there are issues and trends that we feel that the World Data Center will be able to address. Looking at the fact that there is proliferation of knowledge portals. Here we're talking about a lot of preservation, description, discovery and dissemination of knowledge activities taking place. And also, World Data Centers tend to support the rapid development of data and metadata standards. Then you have one format, and then you have different standards, but you have crossworks in between. So the issues that came about was that out of competition that we have, there are different domains and fields that are doing their own things. There's wasteful competition for provision of technology, some divergence of metadata standards, and also competition amongst ourselves. And everybody's saying, out of the meeting that we had last year, why don't you have a central place that we can all say it's a portal, and then we also have certain small portlets in between. The solution then, based on this, was that we can look at shared implementation, and out of shared implementation, we'll look at a framework that contains architecture guidelines, abstract specifications, and user requirements that would flow and ensure that there's interoperability of standards and can also be used for further enhancements and implementations of other portals within Southern Africa and Africa. And also a directed open source community that contributes to or extends and maintains the shared implementation. So it's not owned, it's housed in one institution, but you have different portlets within the big portal. And then also the National Science Foundation or Research Foundation will provide a baseline to operate this national activity. And it's not domain specific, but function specific. That's how World Data Centers operate. The issue of shared meaning, we felt that with a World Data Center concept, we would look towards shared meaning. Here we would look at the issues of metadata standard selections, crosswalks between the fields, and standard translations, and also the issues of control vocabs, thesauri, ontologies related to regions and so forth. Shared processes, and here we're looking at coordinated training, awareness, data sharing, and metadata provision policies, which is quite an issue for us, and especially with capacity building, and also the issue of creating a forum to validate decisions and guidelines based on what we need to do. So we don't need to be inward looking at when we move ahead with a project for the World Data Center. We need to have forums, different domains coming into the place, and then different science institutions coming into the fore, and researchers to say, this is how we want to see the process moving forward. These are our standards. Others use the Darwin Core, others use the ISO standards. From the social sciences, we use different standards too. So that's the whole idea here. Why is the WDC important? It's a low risk and cost-effective way to create a national resource, to make good on and respond to cooperation agreements between nationally and international agreements. And remember, with the World Data Center, you get accreditation every second year. And to raise awareness for us, for South Africa's contribution to science and technology, that's how we see the importance of the World Data Center. And what do we think it's going to contribute? For us, the World Data Center provides a baseline of documentation and knowledge expressed as in user requirements, high-level designs, architecture documentation, and an acceptance test, and so forth, because you can test, you can implement with a first prototype, and then test it, and then implement. I don't have much time. And there are examples of World Data Centers that we feel we have partners with. For example, we have partnerships with the National Biological Information Infrastructure, the US Geological Survey. We went for training on metadata standards and how you actually operate a World Data Center. So the NBII actually hosts a number of data sets that comes from Africa and Southern Africa, especially on climate change. And you look at the pollinators, they have an effect on the way we do science and social science in Africa and Southern Africa. Data One, it's one of those geos. It's typical examples of having domain, not just domain-specific interoperable systems. So that's what we think, that if we move ahead with the World Data Center, this is what we think it's going to be of benefit to Southern Africa and Africa as a whole. And this is just an example of how the NBI website looks like with the US geological one, and then how you can have your standards on the one side and indicate which domain it's that standard for and the data and the tools. So that's just a prototype of what we think we are going to use and implement, but it's going to be South African specific. And this is just our contribution towards how our system is going to work. Then we'll have SCION, which is our node, and then our knowledge management infrastructure within the National Research Foundation, and that's the World Data Center feeding into the prototype. Yeah, I won't bore you with the technical parts. Okay, I would say Nkosi in South African language, Rea leboga in my mother tongue, and Siyabonga Mandela's language, and thank you. Dankie in Dutch. Okay.
Nkosi. Thank you very much, Daisy. That was a fascinating overview of what's a very complex process, and I think we get a feeling from that just how much care has to be taken over these sorts of developments to create data infrastructures that are going to be useful for other researchers to come in and understand what it is that they're working with. Questions for Daisy? I think you've stunned them, Daisy.
That's the whole National Research Foundation. So we don't operate like the other side, like the Science Foundation. We own the zoo, the South African Zoo. It's part of our National Research Foundation. That's why it's important for us to belong to a World Data Center, because of all the activities. The Hermanus Hartebeeshoek, South African Astronomy, it's all part of the National Research Foundation, and they're all scattered throughout Southern Africa. And we also, the largest telescope in Southern Hemisphere, it's owned by the National Research Foundation. Okay, it's part of the logos here. I'm going to point a finger if somebody's not asking a question.
Well, I've got a question for you, Daisy. One of the problems that we've faced in the UK, and I think in other countries as well, is that as we've moved towards more interdisciplinary working, we've encountered different cultural approaches within scientific communities towards the sharing of data. The example I can draw on is in the biomedical sciences, and when social scientists come to work together to create new data and new data infrastructures, the biomedical scientists have the view that they want to have exclusive rights to those data for a period so that they can get their publications. The social scientists believe very much in putting the data out into the public domain so that others can work on it in parallel and in collaboration. And that does pose difficulties. We have to find a solution to those, and it's not easy.
No.
Do you have the same problems with the work that you're doing?
It's a universal problem. We have that in the country where scientists, especially the natural sciences, they still say, what's in it for me? For them, much more, it's not about data sharing, it's about, I want something out of it. If I give, what will I get? Because I think it's with the new democracy in the new South Africa, the government gave the carrot to say, publish more on ISI-based journals, then you'll get the carrot. And now, if I give you my data, what do I get? But now the National Research Foundations look at another angle to say, we give you funding, public money. Where's our data then? We need that data because we want for data purposing and so forth. So it's a carrot and a stick part. And the most interesting part, while you say that with the social sciences, we just got data coming up from the Higher Education South Africa, gave us data on HIV/AIDS in higher education. And this was data funded by European Union it's data for the past 4 years. And a decision was taken by Higher Education South Africa to say that data must be deposited with the South African Data Archive, which is hosted by us as the NSF. So it's quite, with the social sciences, it's not an issue. But human health data, it's also critical, and also, depending also with the ministry that we had regarding human health, and then, what do you call it again? Medical data. If your minister is not open enough with the kind of data that you have, it's not easy to open it up, because if we request our data on human health from the ministry, there are issues again and embargoes. But for us to be able to get data from higher education regarding HIV/AIDS in the country, regarding within higher education, it was just a milestone for us to say it's quite, the country is moving, and people are actually saying we need to share and open up. Yeah.
Okay, Daisy, thank you very much indeed for a very good presentation. I'm now call on our third speaker, Kevin, who's going to address the title of this session. The title, which is Data for International Social Science Research, What We Have and What We Need. Kevin I've known for many years. Kevin is the director of the Economic and Social Data Service at the University of Essex, also the UK Data Archive, and is the leader, coordinator, director of a new and developing research infrastructure called CEST, the Council for European Social Science Data Archives. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. One of the advantages of following Daisy and Julia is that I can cut short some of my presentation just by simply saying, and they've said it already, but said it in a much clearer and more profound way that I can. I think what I'm trying to do in this presentation is look at perhaps a much more generic level, which is why I've kept the title of the session as the title of the paper. You can really go for the short version of this paper or the long version of this paper. The really long version you're not going to get because I actually have to leave here to catch a plane at 4:30. And you'll be thankful for that. The short version is very simple. What do we have? Well, we've got lots of stuff. What do we need? More stuff. But unfortunately, it's not quite that simple because there are all sorts of drivers. And I think the first thing I want to start with is actually reflecting on the fact that this, of course, is an anniversary year for Charles Darwin, who is sometimes given credit, rightly or wrongly, as one of the originators, as one of the most important theories in the last 200 years. Now, this is just an illustration of the drivers. Darwin's theory, or theories, were hugely data-driven. You know, he was an empirical scientist, almost a social scientist to a certain extent. And don't forget that he actually did work in the social sciences. People always think of him as the author of The Origin of the Species, but he actually did an awful lot of work in terms of eugenic type analysis as well, which today would certainly be seen as social science. Now, the thing is, if Darwin had made a grant application to any of the funders sitting in this room, NSF, ISSC, Chad's marvellous organisation in Canada. Now let's think what this application might look like. I'm someone that just scraped a very bad degree in Cambridge and nearly got thrown out as an undergraduate. I've got this idea because I've been on this long 4-year voyage, and I only got a place on that voyage because my uncle paid them lots of money, because he's a very big industrialist. And I'm not quite sure where this research is leading, but it's going to take me 10 years to do, and then I'm not going to publish the results for 30 years. Will you give me money, please? I think the point I'm trying to make is that one of the pressures that social scientists have in the way in which they engage data is also not just about their own use of the data and the way in which they may wish to manipulate those data, but also the constraints often imposed by funders, by our own institutions. In the UK, we have other formula like the research assessment exercise, what will become the research framework, that actually shape what they can actually do. I think very often we actually don't do what we would sometimes like with the data, for the simple reason that there are other constraints of having to get this published, not having the funding to do this, not having the time to do that and well. And we have to think about these questions within those broader contexts. I'm just seeing which of these buttons I press. I thought that I would, as the title of the session suggests, to try and divide this up into two parts, talking about current and future. Although afterwards, I'm beginning to realise that actually that's possibly not such a good idea, because these are very much two sides of a very similar looking coin. But let's go along with that nonetheless. I think one of the first things I started to look at is the geographies of data access. No, New Zealand isn't there, you're absolutely right. It's been absorbed into Australia. This is clearly a good day for offending people. This is something that I drew on the plane, as you can see. And I did think about New Zealand. The point I'm trying to make here is that we talk about north-south divides. Clearly the geography of data access and data availability, and they're not the same thing. You might actually have very good access mechanisms within a country, but not actually much data being made available. Or actually you might have a lot of data being generated and available, but very bad access. So in access, I mean that in both senses of the word. But what I've tried to illustrate here is that the world is a very uneven place in terms of the availability and access to social science data. And it's not as simple as north-south divide. And I think we need to think beyond that, because we often think of Europe as having, quotes, good access, as somebody who's, as Peter said, working on a project at the moment to try and facilitate better access to and more integrated access to data within Europe, and having travelled in the last 6 months in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Lithuania, in Latvia, in Estonia, in Macedonia, in Serbia, in Bulgaria, and I could add to that list, I can tell you categorically, this is Europe in certain areas is not provided with good access. So this is not just about north and south. There are pockets of good access, some of which are in the north, but also there are pockets of good access in the south as well. Australia, I think, is reasonably well provided, and more to the point, the Australian government have injected a lot of money into data infrastructures in the last 24 months, so things are dramatically improving there. So geography of access, and in fact maybe what we need, and we can close the session here, is just simply to change that map into something that looks more like the sort of thing that we would recognise from a classroom atlas. That's our goal. How do we make that map more equitable in terms of international data access? In terms of the current, I thought I'd just put something up about data production. I didn't know before I got here that this wonderful little booklet was going to be in our pack. And of course you've all got this, and if you turn to page 62, the Grand Statesman, I think it's on page 62, has produced his own version. This was something that was published, I can't remember, back in the 70s, I think. And actually what I'm saying here is very similar. He does it in a much more elaborate way, of course, as you would imagine. But realistically still, this was done in the 1970s. The main sources of data production for social science research are clearly within the academic, commercial and governmental sector. And I think actually the balance has changed, possibly. I would argue that probably less data is coming from the commercial sector, and possibly more is being generated by the academic sector. We see particularly within the UK and other examples across Europe and North America and Australia that funding councils compared to when this was published in the 70s are investing much, much more in relatively large-scale data production. I think the balance has shifted between the amount of funding from academic sources going into large-scale social science data production. And that's a good thing, as long as it doesn't actually cut off the streams of information coming from elsewhere. I think the big question we have to ask ourselves, and I'm moving partly here to the future, is that given that social science has traditionally, and I think actually increasingly relies on effectively publicly funded data, whether that's from within academia or from the government sector, what's the impact going to be on what will clearly be a decline on public funding in the years to come? You know, to what extent do we need to prepare for that now? To what extent does that mean that actually we are going to have to move into thinking about researching on sources of data generated from outside of the public purse? Barriers and limitations. Well, there are all sorts of barriers to cross-data data discovery and transfer. I actually think that authorization of use is one of the key ones. And this is one of my bugbears, and those people in the room working with me on trying to build better integrated data infrastructures within Europe will know that one of my main concerns is not the fact that data exists, it's that actually we sometimes erect too many barriers in the way of actually getting hold of those data. And particularly when we're talking about doing research that requires collecting data from many different countries, we don't need a single authorization invariably, we need multiple authorizations. And that can sometimes actually be a real barrier to the researcher for the simple reason that they cannot be bothered or they do not have the time and resource to seek the kind of authorizations that they might need. There are real legal issues and data protection issues that stop data transfers. In Europe, we do, of course, have EU directives on data protection. And these, for example, strictly forbid data to be transferred to, which have potential disclosive issues, to countries which do not have similar legislation. So there are some real legal issues here that stand in the way. My biggest concern, however, with the legal issues is that sometimes the legal issues, I think, are used as an excuse not to facilitate better access, rather than actually solving the legal issues. Again, there's a subtle difference between the two. I think people sometimes hide behind the law, data producers, particularly governmental data producers, hide behind the law and use the law as a reason not to do something rather than actually looking at the problem a different way round. Security will become increasingly an issue, I think, and here I'm beginning to look at the future, and we'll move on. I think also, I'm going to talk about security later on. I think we also need to think about demand. I think this is actually quite serious, and it might require more discussion, because we often talk about, well, what can we do to improve cross-data transfer? What can we improve? What can we do to improve data accesses across country? I seriously wonder sometimes actually what the demand is. If you actually look at most social science outputs, the majority are based on analysing data for a single country. And I do seriously wonder, is that because of a lack of availability of other sources, or just simply they have no interest of doing research on other more than just one country? I think you do have to question the demand. I think the other thing that we have to question is the extent to which social scientists really do want to use multiple data types. As somebody who runs a relatively well resourced, in fact an incredibly well resourced and mature data centre based in the UK, one of the things that actually strikes me is that if you actually look at patterns of use, we have a lot of users. We have 50,000 registered users. This is not a small sample. The majority of those users actually don't use multiple data types. First of all, a handful, and it is almost a handful out of that 50,000, use data which is both quantitative and qualitative. They don't cross that divide despite everything that we might want them to do. And the classic thing is census users tend not to use any other data. Labour force, Peter is of course an exception here, but labour force survey users tend not to use anything other than the labour force. The point is that people often get very stuck into a particular type of data source and tend not to often look at too much outside of that range. And that's based on looking at user statistics over decades and decades. We've got 40 years of user statistics, which we've been analysing fairly recently. And actually, I question the demand to actually, the extent to which social scientists want lots of data. There is quite a lot of data already available that is not being used. So we do have to think a little bit about demand. And let's just go on about discovery now. One of the biggest problems, and again, this isn't a technical problem, the technical solutions have existed for years, but still there is an inherent lack of interoperability between catalogues. And Google itself has created a problem here. Hopefully everybody in this room is an exception, but the majority of students now at university, if you ask them to go away and write something or do a project on something, first thing they will do is type keywords associated with that piece of work into Google and see what comes up. If it ain't in Google, it doesn't exist. But Google is not an interoperative tool. Google does not necessarily deep search data catalogues. So the point is that you cannot rely on Google to be your tool of interoperability when it comes to discovering data. And the point is that we still do not have, although technically it really isn't a problem, but we do not have, unlike the library world, robust tools that will search across multiple metadata collections within the social science data world. That's something that we need to address. And of course within the social sciences, and I think this is more of a problem in the social sciences than it is in a lot of the physical or hard sciences, I think there's a real problem with language and adequate metadata. Because of course the whole point of the social sciences, particularly in looking at comparative social science, is also unraveling cultural difference. And cultural difference is bound up in language difference. A lot of the underlying data or the metadata associated with it has linguistic or language assumptions associated with it. You know, the metadata, the variables, all of these things may exist in multiple languages, which you actually have to understand in order to do your comparative research and to discover these things in the first place. And this is something that particularly we've been aware of in in CESDA, within the Council of European Social Science Data Archives, for a long time, where we've tried to address this by producing a multilingual thesaurus that helps people to discover metadata using different input and output languages, if I can put it that way. But when you escalate this up into a global language, well, we just saw the metadata from Daisy talking just about one South African nation, and we had 5 languages up there, I think it was. You know, how do we deal with these kinds of problems where in order to even discover whether we've got the right data, you have to drill down within this linguistic jungle. Let's move on. Comparative data. Again, I'm talking very much about the current, and I'll rush over this. These are terms I made up, and in that sense, it also is going towards the future. Made, crafted, glued, and mashed. What I mean by that is that there are some already existing, some very, very good data sets. European Social Survey, classic example. Share, classic example. There are others where the data have been made right from the start to be comparative. Eurobarometers. There are others which are crafted where you're actually taking things that look the same, like labour force surveys, which have been carried out independently, where you're crafting them together into a single comparative data source. But that's where the boundaries are actually not that different. And then there are things that are just simply glued together, i.e. there's a survey in this country on, I don't know, criminal justice and attitudes toward it, and there's the British Crime Survey, which isn't quite the same thing, but there's a bulk of questions that vaguely overlap. We pick them out and we glue them together. They don't fit very well, but they allow us to address some comparative issues. And then there's stuff that's just simply mashed together, and actually they have very little in common, but still we do it. And actually you have to seriously ask whether or not A can be compared to B within this mashup. And that's also something that worries me for the future, in that there was an interesting study that was carried out by the British Library in the UK last year that looked at the so-called Google generation and how they discovered data and publications and used them. And one of the findings actually that came out of it is not so much about the discovery, but it was more to do with the fact that they were really prepared to mash things together willy-nilly. They were not interested in provenance. They didn't ask about quality. They didn't ask about whether or not, because of the provenance of this and the provenance of that, they really can actually be mashed together. They just took it off the web, they mashed them together to create a new product. And we do need to think very carefully about that. Future, I'm just going to run through this very quickly because I've already talked about what I think are some of the future requirements in talking about the present. This is really the other side of the coin. Technical requirements, I talked about authentication. We really have to do more work on that. The grid offers some solutions in that. The problem with the grid is that I think the grid has been invented mainly by the hard scientists, where actually the heterogeneity of data is not as great within the social sciences. They don't have the same metadata problems, and it's also partly to do with provenance. Within the hard sciences, the academic domains create much of the data themselves. As I said before, we have a diverse set of data creators in the social sciences, and that's getting widening. Security is going to be a big issue because of personal disclosure and ethical issues. I put trusted repositories in there, but and that's what I mean. You don't only have to trust the source of the data, and you also have to ensure the confidentiality of the respondents in the data. You also have to trust where the data is coming from. Let's move on. Standards, standards, standards. Yes, we all need standards. We can't do all of these things without standards. If anything, we've got too many standards, and what we actually need to do is not invent new standards, but agree on the standards we actually have. And the trouble is we're getting standards almost every day of the week at the moment on different aspects of our work. And actually, I think what we need is standardization over our standards and more mappings. It doesn't matter whether you've got 10 standards as long as you know how they map together. And that's true not just as standards, of course, but in terms of codification of data and so on and so forth. Key thing I want to say about data types, again, what I want you to do is go away and look at Sten Rocken's table on page 62. Very interesting. That was written in a largely pre-digital age. Go away, and when you're over supper tonight, draw up with the people you're having supper with a similar table for a digital age. It will look very, very different. The grid will basically look the same. The point is that we are now collecting all sorts of data that, to be honest, we don't know how to use. And I think we do need to think very carefully about that. What I'm talking here, observational data, administrative data, some of the stuff that Julia was talking about with Web 2 technologies, all this kind of stuff. The trouble is, a lot of it is highly disclosive, and a lot of it runs up against very key ethical issues. And give an example, you might not all know about it. Amazon created a tool that read data into Facebook, so that on your Facebook it would say, so-and-so has just bought this book, and it would tell all the friends and families in the Facebook. It raised, so the technology is there. We can do all these interesting things that Julia was showing. It was then shut down because of the ethical outcry saying, what right have you got to tell my friends that I've just bought a book on cricket or whatever it might be? But, so what was even worse, they would say that this person's also just bought a book for this other person. The point is that there are some clear ethical issues about some of these data, and we need to think through this. And that's why security is going to be a huge, huge issue. To me, this is actually the biggest challenge. It's not about technology per se. The technical issues are actually relatively small. It's making sure that we have the trust of both the data respondents and the data producers in terms of disseminating, giving access to, and providing this data. And particularly if we want to have that in an international context, we have to move away from safe people and safe places to safe virtual settings. That's the biggest challenge. And I think I've only got one more, and I just want to end with this. Julia has already talked about lots of interesting new methodologies, and I really don't want to repeat what she said. There is one thing that I think is the most important that we have to invest in. It's very easy to invest in technology. It's very easy to invest in collecting new data. Imagination is actually what we really need. Because actually, I think some of what we're sometimes lacking in the social sciences is courage of conviction and the imagination to bring together data from multiple types, multiple sources, multiple domains, and across border. It's not a technological barrier. It's not necessarily even a legal barrier. It's not even necessarily an accessibility barrier. We need to give people the time to come up with the ideas. That's a different issue. And I'll leave you with that thought.
Kevin, don't go away. There may well be some questions.
That's
for
why
you
I'm going.
here, so. Yes, first of all, Julia, then.
So your question about the demand for data really resonated. I think there is a huge demand, but not just for generic data, it has to be usable data. So for example, the cross-country data set that has had the biggest impact in recent years, the biggest NSF investment in social science data was cross-country, and it was IPAMS. So international census data that was standardized and made available has had thousands of users and thousands of people adopt it. So I don't think there's a lack of demand for data per se. It's usable and accessible data that's the critical point.
I think there are two issues here. As a contributor to IPAMS, of course it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. However, what IPAMS doesn't monitor is the extent to which people are taking data out of IPAMS for comparative analysis. You can actually take data out country by country and analyze them country by country. So I'm not entirely sure I agree. I mean, I was basing it on, I think there's also a big difference. I mean, again, I can explain in the UK case, we have, because of the ESRC's investment within ESDS, different aspects of the service. One bit is called ESDS International, which has been very successful in developing access mechanisms to aggregate international data, particularly coming from NGOs. And that's had huge use, very successful in building new user communities. I think, and I should have perhaps made this point right from the start, that's all aggregate though, where the comparison is actually relatively naive, if I can use that term. It's creating effectively a relatively small table which shows that for these 10 countries, GDP varies from X to Y. Now that's not very exciting comparative analysis. Might be important. What I'm talking about in comparative analysis is the basic lack, and I can see it. We obtain data from other countries for people within the UK, and it may well be that people in the UK are just simply not interested as much in comparative analysis as they should be. But the number of people who use UK-only data as opposed to data from 2 or more countries is minimal in terms of the overall data using population we serve, and that's the simple point I'm making.
Let's take one more question and a brief response, please, Kevin.
It's not a question, it's just a comment on but IPAMS, one of the things they do is they translate all of the metadata.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry.
this gentleman here. Sorry about that.
I'm glad you referred to the table by Stein Rokkan, because it reminds me that almost 37 years ago, Stein Rokkan, together with Shandor Shalai and Evan Scheuch, convened a meeting in Budapest on the methodology of comparative research, which was published some 5 years later. They all would be very happy to know how much progress in terms of availability of data has been made. But at the same time, the criticism, the methodological criticism and awareness of the problems of comparative research has not only not kept pace with the data collection, but in fact hasn't progressed at all. And I think something in this area has to be done and is necessary as well. I just would like to recall a meeting, a lecture I heard in Frankfurt from the German representatives in the EU responsible for regional disparities and these things. And he presents a nice graph. The greatest disparities are in Great Britain. And of all EU nations, and ask him, well, how many regions are there north of the Caledonian Canal? Because it goes something like GDP divided by square mile or something. So he responds by the regions he understands best in his land state within Germany, and that's all the other definitions are national. And I think this is the basis of policy within the EU to reduce regional disparities. So I assume there is a problem which has to be addressed by social scientists, and it can't be addressed by the bureaucrats in Brussels.
Okay, I'm not sure there's a
No, I think that's a
question in there,
comment,
but
not a
very good
question.
comment, yes,
Thank you.
indeed. Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, and let's move on quickly now to Adalberto. Adalberto Cardoso is the research director at UPER, the University Institute of Research of Rio de Janeiro. Adalberto is a sociologist by training. I'm an economist, and I must admit he's one of my favourite sociologists.
Oh,
So, Adalberto, over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Peter Elias for the invitation to be here, and ISSC for funding. What I'm going to do here, this presentation is probably going to be a bit anticlimactic after these three previous ones, because I'm going to talk about one data set in Brazil, which is very important in a way, because this is based on administrative records. And administrative records are a kind of ugly ducks of social research. Basically because in some areas, like health and violence, they are inevitable. But even in these areas, researchers use survey research either to complete, to complement, or to criticize administrative data. This is so much the case for employment data based on firms' administrative information, because most of the times governments collect these information to inspect firms, right, or to make them comply with existing regulations like taxes regulations and others. So firms do have an incentive and reasons to misinform governments through their administrative information. So what I'm going to show here is one data set in Brazil that has, in a way, managed to circumcise this limitation and build a reliable system of quality administrative data on employment research, on employment, based on firms, right, information. This data set is based on a legislation from 1966, which mandated that all firms in Brazil had at least 2/3 of the employees as Brazilians, right? Well, Brazil is a country of huge immigration, and in the beginning of the 20th century, immigration was important. Some 80% of manufacturing employees in 1910 were immigrants, foreign and mostly Italians. So this law came to enforce the employment of Brazilians. So after 1966, all firms in Brazil had to inform on a monthly basis their hiring and firing movements. And data on employees included, of course, nationality, right, because this law was to enforce national employment, sex, age, schooling, occupation, and income. And firms were classified basically by economic sector. So this was it. This was a simple data set like that. In 1975, the Annual Relation of Social Information, HISE, was created to control and inspect mechanisms of various salary-based taxes and social benefits. So it was an employment surveillance system, right? Information is also provided by firms in an annual basis now, okay? And since 1995, this is done exclusively online. All firms must inform that, right? Public and private. In 1991, and this is the main target of this presentation, the Ministry of Labor started a limited program of dissemination to the research community and some public officials, right? Some public administrations at the provincial and municipal levels. In 1993, the ministry associated with the National Manufacturing Service to generate a new data set based on this HISE, which was called HISE Migra. This was to try and track the dismissed from workers dismissed from manufacturing since 1989 because Brazil was going through a deep industrial restructuring. So manufacturers were wanting to design reskilling and qualification policies to train these dismissed or people made redundant after restructuring. In 1995, this data set was extended to include all dismissed workers, and workers were tracked back to 1985. Okay, and the data set is now goes until 2007. From 2000 to 2003, myself, was a consultant to the Ministry of Labor in the production of one new data set based on Migra, and it's based on links. The Migra data set asks the worker if a worker was employed in 1995, for instance, and looks again in 96, right? And then you can compare if the worker was there. The new data set is an event history data set based on all that, okay? And we have all events, employment events in Brazil since 1985, okay? And this is a huge data set. It has some 6 terabyte archive available and some 700 million records nowadays. And it's available online through the internet. Anyone can get in, you can get in, right, well, like I said, there are some problems with these records. We know that misinformation is not random, right? We know that different firms have different reasons not to inform properly. So, and we know that incentives for quality information may and do work sometimes, especially money incentives, right? But we cannot inspect the process of production of these information in firm, right? This is too expensive. So what the Ministry of Labor does, only an ex post criticism, okay? This is the only possibility. IT information technology, of course, has made this much more trustful. And why? The Migra event, or this event history data set, has generated as an unexpected result the possibility of quality inspection of the available data. Why? Because we look at the information provided by firm in 2007 and then track back this information of the same link in the previous years. So if the firm informed differently in previous years, and if this is a major firm, or if it can be identified, the Ministry of Labor just take the phone and phone them. Look, what's going on? So the data process and information is being cleared and made much more reliable because of this data. So it was an unexpected research consequence. The research potentials of this kind of data set is enormous. You can perform all kinds of survival analysis, like firm lives or firm duration, right? What happens to firms during economic shocks, economic restrictions. You can track groups of workers throughout time. You can track groups of occupations throughout time. You can test for the survival of occupations during economic restriction. And you can perform all kinds of event history analysis of firms, of workers, of occupations, and so on. And also panel studies, social mobility studies, work mobility studies, whatever. So this is a huge, huge tool available to. The main limit is that it is restricted to the formal labor market. In a country like Brazil, where 67% of the existing employment is formal, then this means that 37% of the population is not included. Well, in a way, this is a limit, right? But we know the turnover rate in Brazil is so high that once in a while, everyone gets into this data set, right? So you have spots of these people who are outside here and then. So when we're talking about 700 million links and events, we're possibly talking about or we have at least one photograph of all workers in the country since 1985. Well, this is how it looks. And it's very friendly through the internet. You just click there, Raiz Migra, and then it brings you can choose Migra panel or Migra links, and then you go to, you have to choose the year of admission. So this is an event history data, very, very straightforward, right? The year and month of admission, and then you have the variables you choose. You choose here, like people hired in 2000, and dismissed in 2006, right? And then by industry, and then if they were admitted again, right, where, and then you have a table. This is through the internet, right? And you can perform lots of research out of this. But you also can have a DVD with information. You can ask for information. Oh. It's easy like that. And this DVD brings information. You can. This is free, right? You just order. The Ministry of Labor sends this to you along with the software, and you can ask, for instance, this is just about the state of Rio, right? You have 45 million records here, and you go into the cities, right, and into the firms. You can track firms in a special city all over the country, and the important thing about this is that you can just choose one particular cell, this 24,000 records, and then you can identify these cells, these individuals, not as persons, but as numbers, right? And then you can extract all the information available on these people, and then you can build whatever you want with these data. You can bring it to SPSS or to SAS or whatever. So you are not restricted to the software and tools that the ministry gives to you. So you can export data and do whatever you wish with it. The key thing about this is that the research community was called to engage in the quality inspection of this data set, right? And so dissemination of this was crucial. So it began in 1993, and nowadays we have like maybe 2,000 people working in a regular base in Brazil with these informations, right? And this retrofed the process of quality production. And the Ministry of Labor thinks that nowadays this data set covers 98% of the formal labor market, and that the quality of the information is very, very good for larger firms, not so much good for micro firms, but as a whole, this is a very good and reliable information. So again, dissemination was crucial, right? But not only that, there was this government drive to produce good and reliable data set. So that's it. Like I said, it would be a bit anticlimactic.
Well, I think you do yourself an injustice, Adalbert. I think many of us look open-mouthed and gape, eyes wide open at the incredible nature of this resource. Of course,
Yeah.
it raises lots of issues that we've faced in other countries about disclosure and disclosure control and so on. Any questions?
I think it also raises a question, some imaginations of what you could do with it beyond labor research. And I understood well that it is anonymous yet accessible on the individual level.
Yeah.
My question would be, do you have a key somewhere which would allow record linkage? Because this morning we had a fascinating session on cumulative complexity research, which is agent-based. And the keyword agent-based is what triggers the potential beyond labor work. I think if you could relate this fantastic database to other fields of research and similar longitudinal databases, that is, I think, where the social sciences of the future will be going.
Yeah. Well, the idea, the Ministry of Labor is associated with other governmental agencies in connecting all national data sets, right, through the ID number of the worker that links jobs, taxes, health system, all kinds of work-related insurance systems, right, social rights and everything. So yes, it's being done in Brazil, and because the ID is hidden for us, right, but not for government officials. So government is using this as a wide control, inspection, and also a public policy mechanism. And we can do this. We can have access to this, right? But in not identifying the person, but we can identify the processes. So this is important.
Any other questions? Julia?
How do you deal with the disclosure issues?
Well, as long as the individuals are identities are
You can re-identify people very quickly with longitudinal data like that.
in a way, because you just have sex, right? But you don't have the name of the firm. You don't have you have the city, but you don't have the neighborhood, or you have nothing. You just have sex, age, income, occupation. You can, but you have to be a very good detective, and you know. There's always
be enough to re-identify people, and you have the change.
Yeah.
You have the industry, right?
Yeah, the industry. Yes, yes. But well, so far, no. So far, this has not been an issue for the Ministry of Labor, at least, right? Even though it is an issue when it comes to census data, for instance, right?
Well, you should say, so far, trusted the academic community.
Yeah.
Rules.
Yeah.
Over the.
Of course, we sign agreements to have access to these data, to open them like this in a CD. We sign an agreement with the Ministry of Labor, saying that we have limits on how we're going to use it, what we're going to publish about it, and etc. So there's criminal consequences if you don't do that, right?
Okay.
Does the government stick to the same rules, or could they?
We hope so.
That is key.
We hope so. Yes. Yeah. But since for the government, this is an inspection mechanism, right, and surveillance mechanism of the functioning of firms, not workers, right? A government wants to know if firms are complying to the regulations, especially work-related regulations and rights. The target is firms, right, not the people. And of course, the government can disclose the firms, but we cannot. That's the most important thing.
Okay, we're moving towards the end of this session. I'm going to throw it open now for any general questions that you might have. I think we've lost Kevin already. He's had to dash off. But to Daisy or Julia and Alberto, if you have any further questions you wish to pose. And if not, then I shall just say on behalf of the conference organisers and myself, of course, I would like to thank very much our speakers who've travelled from far and wide to be here in Bergen. I hope you've enjoyed the visit, and we thank you very much for the information that you've presented to us today. Thank you all very much.